I want to pick back up on the story of Samuel in 1 Samuel as we as I begin the series on family worship and start by talking about spiritual trajectory. Ultimately, I'm talking about the importance of the home and the role of the home, specifically the role of the father in the spiritual trajectory of the child or of the family as a whole. We can see a great contrast, a great story here in 1 Samuel of different people being raised in the same home. Ultimately, I have the picture of Samuel, who will grow to become a very godly leader under the same leadership that these other two young men, Hophni and Phinehas, were raised under, and they grew to be very ungodly people, both ultimately living under the same roof as Eli, the father, the true father of Hophni and Phinehas. However, two radically different outcomes. Samuel could be argued was ultimately being raised by God himself, and that God had raised him up in a very special way for a very special purpose. But Hophni and Phinehas were certainly raised by their father. So picking that story back up, I pointed out in chapter 1, verse 3, how these two men, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. They were the spiritual leaders there at Shiloh. They were the ones that were receiving the temple sacrifices. They were the ultimate point people for day-to-day worship, for the specific worship of Israel. It was a significant position. These men were elevated above others. However, there was a problem. These men were wicked. They were evil. And you can see that there in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, beginning in verse 12. It says, "Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord." Now, that's kind of interesting because these were the two men that were ultimately the go-between man and God. They were the mediators between God and man. Praise God now that we have one mediator between God and men, the man, Jesus Christ, according to the Apostle Paul. Well, these were the mediators, and according to the Bible, they did not know the Lord. Now, this is a problem. This is a very significant indictment upon these two men, especially given the fact that they're set in contrast to Samuel, this young boy who was worshiping God very early. Very early. So these young men, verse 17, their sin was evident. It was evident to everyone. But if verse 17 says, "Thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt." So everyone knew about it. Samuel, I don't know if he was aware or not. He may have been too young. I'm not sure in the very beginning. But Eli was growing aware, but God was certainly aware. God was aware of what was taking place in his family, and we're about to see him intervene in a very specific way. We see their sin outlined there in verses 13 through 16, at least a part of their sin. We also find out that they were having ungodly relations with some women that were there ministering at Shiloh, but we see a significant problem in verse 17. But notice 17 and 18. Verse 17 says the young men, they were sinning in a great way before the Lord. But verse 18, here's this contrast again. It says Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed with a linen ephod. So you can see kind of a recovery of this biblical model of holiness and being set apart for God's service. So there's a contrast in this book. You'll see them in the first three chapters kind of compared one to another. In verse number 21, we see this young man, Samuel, is growing in the presence of the Lord. So they're all growing. It's just some are growing away from and some are growing towards the Lord. Verse 22, chapter 2. "Now Eli was very old, and he kept hearing all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And he said to them, Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all the people. No, my sons, it is no good report that I hear the people of the Lord spreading abroad. If someone sins against a man, God will meditate for him. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him?" Now I want you to catch this. Eli is rebuking his sons. He's heard the testimony multiple times, and certainly he knows God is very aware of what his sons are doing. But I want you to see when he confronts his children, something specifically unique happens in verse number 25. It gives us insight into this home. Were they conducting family worship from the start? I have no idea. We have no way of ultimately determining that. Did Eli do a good job of discipling his kids? I don't know. Did Eli do a good job of passing on the faith? We'll see that throughout the Old Testament, this idea of setting up reminders so that children can see those things and turn to the fathers and say, "Father, what is this about?" And the father can sit down and do that Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 6 and following type of discipleship and say, "Well, this is what it's about. Let me tell you about the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob that brought us out of Egypt, that did all these things. I want to tell you about the covenant. I don't know if those things happened, but I can see something diagnostically within the family that indicates there was a problem in verse number 25. So Eli rebukes his sons, points out, listen, you guys are sinning against God. You've got no hope here. This is a problem. Then he says this, but they would not listen to the voice of their father. But they would not listen to the voice of their father. Now, again, don't want to speculate and go too far here. There are a lot of outside circumstances. There's context we're not altogether certain of, but I don't think we need to overlook the simplicity of this text. But they would not listen to the voice of their father. There was a disconnect. There was a significant disconnect between Eli and his sons. They were no longer submitting to him as father. They were no longer listening to his wisdom. They were no longer, at least specifically, taking his spiritual counsel. There was a problem here, a pretty significant problem. And look at verse 26. There's that contrast again. Now the young man Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with man. So we see it all come to a head here, beginning in verse number 27. There came a man of God to Eli and said to him, thus the Lord has said, did I indeed reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt subject to the house of Pharaoh? Now I want you to catch this. Did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest? Now he's referring to Eli's father. Now we do not have a specific lineage drawn between Eli and Aaron. However, that is a case that can be made very clearly from the scriptures. In 1 Chronicles, we can see this connection between Ahimelech, the great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Eli, and how he is tied back to the sons of Ithamar, one of the sons of Aaron. And so we can see that Eli is in the lineage of Aaron. So I want you to catch this. There's a godly line. God chooses Aaron. Aaron is set aside for worship. Aaron's discipling his own children. He's raising them up. He's raising up a people in the service of God. Ithamar is an example, but it begins to break down somewhere. We don't know how far down the road it broke down, but it broke down to the degree that Hophni and Phinehas of this chosen family line are gone. There's no generational continuity. They are totally gone. And now we're going to see here that God's judgment is upon him. Verse number 34, and this that shall come upon your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be the sign to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and what is in my mind. So these guys were not faithful priests. They were not serving God, but yet they were raised in a home, a godly home, or at least it should have been a godly home, with Eli ultimately with the responsibility to disciple his children. So as we begin this, or as I begin this series of videos on family worship, I just want to show how significant this generational continuity is. And I want to talk about this spiritual trajectory. Where a child begins spiritually will oftentimes, in many ways, if that beginning point is continued on, if it's supported by the father, if it's supported by the home, if there's a concerted effort to continue that along, that early trajectory will oftentimes match their eternal destiny, as it were, or at least their lifelong perseverance. If in the beginning just a passing glance is paid to God, to Christ, then that's what's going to happen. One time I went to a woman's house, a family's house, doing follow-up for a VBS, and the family had shipped off their kids to VBS, and I began talking with her about the Lord and inviting her to church. And she said, you know what, I don't need to go to church, I'm just sending my kids. And she said, ultimately, my parents did the same thing for me. They sent me off to church, and look at how I turned out. And ultimately, I was faced with either being silent or saying something. And so I said, ma'am, I just don't know that it's anything other than just nonsensical to think that our children won't follow in our steps. They will. They will follow in our steps in most cases, specifically in the case of carrying on this generational continuity of Christ-likeness. So we're going to talk about family worship. We're going to talk about this importance of continuing on this line in the home. And we're going to talk about the role of the father. So the next video, I'm just going to begin walking right through family worship. And as we do that and look at family worship, as discipline, as teaching, discipleship, etc., we'll take a look at some of more of the biblical cases for this. And we'll also get to some of the practical applications on how to work this out.